everyone, welcome to another Random Talk Sunday, and today I thought it would be interesting to discuss something that's not only random but a little bit more general, since we are out of the month of love and we are going into March, which is basically the month of St. Patrick's Day, which I hopefully can do a video on later within the month to sort of address maybe the history or really what is St. Patrick's Day, because I think it's probably one of the more obscure holidays that people don't really think about, but all that will be for this coming month. But for now, I'm going to be discussing for this Random Talk Sunday something that has been kind of crossing my mind over these past couple of weeks as I've been sort of keeping up with sort of what's going on, especially on the YouTubes and whatnot, and around everywhere else. And I've noticed something, and that is that there is this huge emphasis, I think in particular this day and age, when it comes to movements. Now, these movements that I'm talking about can be either fairly general, or they can also be fairly specific or be for a specific cause. And what I've noticed about movements is that I don't really like to be categorized in a movement. I like to think for myself, and I don't like putting a label on to who I am. And usually this is, people will hold up signs saying I am so-and-so because blah, blah, blah. And to me, I think the problem with movements is that they, a lot of the times, lead to this sense of groupthink. Where people suddenly start becoming part of that movement because it's what's popular, it's what's trending, it's what's getting the headlines. So I think that's really a huge problem that I have with movements, is that they basically start about with this whole concept and then they take it to everyone and think that everyone should be somehow a part of it. Or somehow embrace it completely without letting the person really think for themselves if this is really something that really identifies with them or is really a part of their values. So, and again, I like to have my own personal set of values and standards that I hold for myself. And I think what movements do is they bring it down to the lowest common denominator and say, yeah, you're this because you're for this. And when you really look at what the movement is doing, you see that it's really having this, it's creating this sense of where everybody thinks exactly in that same way. They think they think together, they don't think individually. And this is how sort of I think these movements a lot of the times have gotten started in the past, as people came together and they thought of this one ideal that they thought was somehow important, but then they never thought to question whether or not this really applies to everybody, or if this movement is really all that necessary, or is something that you really need to proclaim out there and put into the mainstream or make a big deal out of. The thing about being identified with a movement is that I want to be identified as myself. I don't want to be identified as anything else. I don't want to be put under a label. And I think that's what movements largely do. They put you under this label. But at the same time, there's a lot of pride people get out of putting themselves under a label. Want to know why? Because there's a lot of attention that comes from it. ooh, I am so and so, and I feel so superior, and look at me, and I'm so fabulous, and ooh, look at this bigger thing that I'm a part of, and I'm so cool, and everybody has to be cool like me and be a part of this. It's again, it's really establishing that sense of group think, like get everybody to start thinking the exact same way and put ourselves under that umbrella. Um, and I think this is a huge problem, because once you start putting everybody under a big umbrella, nobody starts to question or think for themselves. They just think plainly, oh, this is what this movement stands for. No, no, it can never be questioned. It was always right 100%. When you look at a lot of the times these movements, there's a lot of complicated aspects to them, and maybe not everything that somebody was pushing for was maybe not the best idea. Um, so yeah, there's just a lot of different things that I think can come out of movements that I think result in people just not thinking for themselves and just following the crowd and not taking in what they ultimately think and what they ultimately value. So I think um, that's just something to consider. I think when it comes to these kinds of what they call movements. And oftentimes movements end up developing sort of checklists like, you're only a true so and so if you're this, if you're that, if you're this and that. And that's the thing that where it leads to the kind of even more groupthink than the movement already is. And you set rules, you set standards, you set ideals, and then you tell everybody to follow those sets of rules and ideals when not everybody can really follow. Again, not everybody can follow certain rules and certain ideals that maybe you're spreading. Again, but there are certain things that you can, again, that apply to things like law. Like, I'm not talking about law per se as much as I'm discussing more of values and just philosophy and things like that. Those kinds of things I'm more talking about, that usually these movements end up putting forward in front of people. And I think that can be a huge problem when people start, again, totally absorbing the checklist and not considering their own ideas and opinions. Um, and not only is there a bragging that comes with spreading your label, your I am so and so, I am this and this, I do this and this, I should be so proud, yay, ha. I should have so much pride because apparently I have this. What ends up happening is that not only do people brag, but they spread it to other people, and they kind of push their ideals on other people. They push the whole idea that we need to change things, that we need to constantly update, and we have to change because that's the only way forward, is we always have to change everything in order for things to be better. When really you don't really have to change anything, you just have to leave things be, and then ultimately people will naturally form into whatever they ultimately want to be. I mean, you don't need to enforce a change constantly and think that change is really the only way to get anything better. Um, and again, I think this oftentimes leads to the kind of change brainwashing idea that we need to constantly change society because society is so bad. And it's like, well, it's not really necessarily bad, it's just people have different values, they have different understandings of the world, different kinds of amounts of intelligence. So really, to claim that we need to change society is not necessarily usually most of the times those changes don't really come naturally, because there are certain people who are going to be the way that they are, and you can't change that. Um, so yeah, I think there's just those things that that come with these movements that I think really um, do end up putting more of a making things even more complicated and more divided than actually bringing us sort of closer together as, I guess, a human species, you could say. Um, and again, there are people who are going to have similar, again, they're going to have similar culture, similar understandings, similar ideas, and then there's going to be people who have different ideas and different emphases on certain values. Um, and but that doesn't mean that you need to create a movement for it. You don't need to, just because you have this thing doesn't mean you have to create a movement for it. It doesn't need a movement, just be who you are. That's all you need to do. You don't need to go around and, claim to the world that I am this, and now I'm gonna go spread whatever I believe to everybody else, because everybody else should follow what I believe. And I think that just doesn't ultimately end up amounting to much. Because not everybody, you can't change people's minds all the time. You can't change the way certain people think about things. That's just kind of how it is. And a movement is not going to suddenly make everything okay. So I think that's just something that I think people don't understand sometimes, and don't really consider when they're you know picketing for whatnot. Um, and I think there's oftentimes within movements you see sort of a power structure created, where you have leaders and people who develop their own ideas and claim that to be sort of the narrative, when it might not necessarily be certain people's ideas or ways of thinking. Um, but again, it creates that similar kind of power structure, that idea of you have a leader who's in charge of the movement and who gets you to where ultimately the movement needs to go. Um, so, and again, I think this also can lead to, unfortunately, a lot of manipulation. Look at the way, for example, um, Malcolm X within the 60s um, was heavily influenced by the um, prophet Elijah Muhammad. But then once he discovered really the true nature of his leader that he embraced as part of the sort of um, movement for African Americans in particular, um, you see how ultimately Malcolm X was really distraught when he found out the certain values that Muhammad was preaching really weren't the values that he ultimately had for himself. And so there was a hypocrisy, and it completely warped his way of thinking. So that's what I think some people need to understand when it comes to movements. It's not always a black, not always a white all the time. There's a lot of inner layers when it comes to a movement. So I think what people don't realize is that there sometimes can become and a lot of the times there becomes a power structure where people follow the one person who will lead them to what is supposed to be a better future. But sometimes that person that she might be following might not be someone who actually is really preaching true ideals when he doesn't even embrace those ideals himself. So again, I think there's a huge amount of hypocrisy, and then at the same time, it's a means of manipulation and trying to control people. And again, that's just how, that's sometimes how governments end up getting formed. For example, with Hitler, he was part of a movement when Germany was in distraught after World War One. So again, and he became a successful leader. Not a nice leader, obviously, not a good leader at all, but he became a successful leader because people followed him. People believed in his movement and his ideals. So that's just something I think people need to consider when it comes to these kinds of issues. Is that sometimes there ends up becoming a power structure, and that again doesn't allow people to think for themselves, doesn't allow people to question, what's going on. So I think that's something that I think I've noticed among these different kinds of movements. See, the thing is too is I don't think all movements are bad or harmful, but um I think what is bad is to push an idea onto everybody, to go out there and claim that somehow, oh, I have all the answers, this is the right thing, and you should be for this because I say so, because I speak for you. Um, oh, it's because it's the right thing to do. When, again, there might be some good intentions behind a movement, but at the end of the day, you're not going to convince people to be a part of something that they don't ultimately believe in. It's just, you just can't do it. You can't push your agenda. It's just, you can only, your ideas can only go so far. So I think um, I think that's what I think people don't understand is that they think that they can somehow convince everybody to somehow think in the same way, and then somehow we'll have a better society for it, when obviously I think it's, for me personally, I think that we're better off if we think more on an individual level, rather than in a, big mass. I think if we think for ourselves, we'll be better off. So I think there's another thing about movements that kind of deters me away from supporting them, and I think that's just the level of preachiness. There's just an amount of shoving in your face of whatever people believe in into your throat that you can take. And also I think it also has this connotation of being holier than thou. Like somehow I'm better than you because I believe in this, or somehow I am superior because I think this. And well, yeah, maybe you might be superior in some senses, but at the uh, in in some way, but it doesn't mean that you're better just because you identify as so and so. They label it as a sense of pride, when really it's just nothing. It doesn't say anything about you. It doesn't say anything about who you are as a person. You're just spreading a movement, and to be honest, I think that people should just honestly think more for themselves and not be taken in by these groups, because I think what ends up happening is that people develop their own. Again, it's kind of like developing their own uh, group, and then excluding and you know thinking that everybody else that's outside the group is dumb, whatever. I think it creates more division among us than actually bringing us closer together. I think if people thought on a more individual level, the more closer we would become together as in a society. because we would be comfortable with ourselves and not feel like we need to reinforce our ideals onto everybody. So I think that's just something that um, that's important to note. Again, you don't need to create a movement around values. Values are good to have, and I think they're essential, but we don't need to create a movement for them. We don't need to create this huge thing where everybody makes a big deal about it. You just need to go on living those values and living those ideas. Why do you need a movement to support your cause? Now, I'm not saying, again, all movements are bad per se. For example, civil rights movement. Perfect example of people standing up um, for their rights as individuals. Okay, but largely what I see today, largely what I've come in contact with, is these movements that are just there for the sake of sort of quasi being in a club. Just being there just because you're so cool and yeah, you deserve to have a movement put on you because of X, Y, and Z. Um, Instead of just going about living your life and not feeling like you need to put a label on yourself. Even if you maybe identify within one particular group, it's like, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's maybe a part of me, but it's not everything. It's, again, it's this whole idea of, I think, more groupthink, more people thinking collectively. And to be honest, I like to think things through on a more individual level and not so on this on, I don't like to think I don't like other people to do the thinking for me, let's just say that. And I think that's what movements do. They create the thinking for other people. They create the narrative and then they go out and um try to change society for the sake of their narrative. Um as opposed to seeking, really individual rights like, heck, the right to vote or things like that, civil rights, individual rights, decency, respect, things like that. It's not about that anymore. It's just about people getting together and saying how awesome they are and then going out there and, reinforcing that and making a big movement and a big deal out of it when really it doesn't need to be. There doesn't need to be a huge movement. There doesn't need to be a big deal about it. And yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with, again, more spreading of the personal views, like what you personally feel. Um, Instead of just keeping those thoughts and opinions to yourself, it's like, why do you need to exploit that opinion? Why do you need to feel like everybody needs to share your opinion? Why do you think that everybody needs to think the way you do? And embrace the way you think. I mean, just be yourself and forget about it. I mean, you don't need to go around preaching, to the choir about, yeah, how awesome we are because we feel this and we think this and blah blah blah. Uh, so yeah, I think that's just something that I noticed when it comes to a lot of movements that are out there nowadays. Is there a large appeals to emotion and there's no individual kind of rationale behind a lot of the things that they were claiming to be a part of and be um, and have a movement for. It's largely just about people sort of getting together and just being in a club and sharing the same kind of understanding of things. Um, and to be honest, I think people are a lot more comfortable around people who are kind of similar to them and have similar interests and hold sort of similar ideals. And I think people are just going to, you know, identify with people in that way, but we don't need to create a movement about those ideals and about those, you know, ways of thinking. We can just live our lives. I think that's the best way to do it. And if you don't like the way somebody's treating you, well, then go out and try to change that perception and change it on your own. You don't need a movement to label yourself under. Just go and do it on your own, as opposed to asking for help from some random people and getting them all together to, you know, support something that, again, may or may not be really necessary to create a movement around, because usually protests don't really lead to much. You know, they don't really lead to anything. Usually a movement or anything like that, usually movements, um, again, when you really look at the grander scheme of things, in large part, movements were really changed when people's perceptions and values changed over time. They came gradually once people started thinking more in a different way, and society had certain changes that ultimately ended up happening that allowed for that change to come. Again, it's just that simple. So I think that's what a lot of people miss. They like to think that these movements really did make a hugely profound impact, when really, in large part, it was because there was this societal shift and people were ultimately, as a whole, changing, just or in large numbers changing, despite um, you know, with really without you know, protests going on, or, you know, picketing or whatnot. Usually things change gradually once there is a significant amount of people who embrace those kinds of changes, you know, and embrace that kind of way of thinking. And usually it'll be applied into law or whatnot, you know, but we don't need movements, I think. I think movements largely, in part, again, not all, but I think a huge majority of them, at least, and again, this is a majority of them nowadays, are just about preaching how awesome, you know, that one group is, and making everybody fit into that movement. And to be honest, I don't want to be fit into a movement. I just want to be me. And I don't want to be anybody else. So, and I don't want to be identified as one particular person or belong to this one particular group. And yeah, it might be true. I might be a part of the white race, I guess you could say. But that doesn't identify anything beyond, you know, just who I am, just a part of who I am. But it doesn't mean that that's really me, you know, and that's, you know, that it's just a fact. It's not, you know, it's not part of my viewing or understanding of the world. So I think that's really just something that I've noticed over the years, is that there's been a lot huge emphasis on movements, in particular within university, um, you know, and creating these various clubs and all this stuff. And again, it's largely for people who, you know, again, are not really me necessarily, but at the same time, it's again just sort of preaching. It just feels very preachy, and to the whole choir of like, yeah, be a part of this movement, yeah, be a part of our club, yeah, be a part of this thing. When, to be honest, I don't really want to be a part of that thing. I just want to go about my business and just live my life. That's, you know, why do I need to waste my time with this? So I think largely, in part, a lot of them are a waste of time, and they don't end up amounting to much, and people are just end up getting mad over things that really ultimately do end up getting changed. Um, and you know, you're not going to change people's perceptions on certain issues. That's just how it is. People are going to go about and do their own thing, and I think the more we think in that mindset, and the more we think of how can I change things on an individual level, to maybe make my life better, then I think we would be better off than creating a movement of this or having a movement of that or X, Y, and Z. So, yeah, it's just something that I noticed and that I thought was interesting to talk about. And yeah, I think there's just a lot there's just a lot of things within movements that really do bother me, and those lists that I came up with really do sort of explain my reasonings. But again, I think some movements can have justification to them, like the civil rights movement or things like that. Those can be totally understandable. But with these kinds of movements that come about just for the sake of having a movement and then, you know, having everybody believe in the one same thing and not letting any other idea come into play, or just kind of creating an us against them mentality. Again, it just ends up leading to more divisions within society, I think. And I think people would be better off not identifying as blank, but rather just being themselves and just being people and not putting labels on them. But ultimately, I think, again, that's really all I can say about this topic. But again, if there are any questions, comments, concerns, be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year. And I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.